somatic reflexes. Anybody? I have one copy. Does anybody need a copy? You got it on one side. Okay. So the spinal cord is the information superhighway, right? So it's where information goes up and then down to and from the brain. So it's a communication network for the brain to communicate with the rest of the body. Now we'll see the function of the spinal cord. This is not something I'll ever ask you specifically on an exam, but just gives you a nice little four-piece summary of what the spinal cord really does. So it says nerve fibers conduct information up and down the cord. Well, think about a highway. What does a highway do? Well, we have certain lanes that are designed to go up and other lanes that are designed to go down. And that's what we're going to see. We're going to see things called tracks. Do you remember, they're like nerves, but they're in the central nervous system, called them tracks. Some of these tracks are going to be going this way, and other tracks are going to be coming down this way, just like lanes on a highway. So it's literally like a highway. It goes in, up and in down for information. So you can imagine, for example, that the sensory or picking up sensations is going to go up to the brain so we can interpret them, right? And then motor control, which would be how we're going to slam on the brake after we've seen the red light, will be going down the cord. So we'll be talking about ascending and descending pathways. Just to give you a heads up where we're going. So that's conduction. Neural integration. Neural integration simply means figuring out what the sensations mean, for example, and determining how to respond to those signals. So we see the red light. We understand that means stop, and we're going to press the brake. That's the integration idea. Now, some of these integrations can be very, very simple. Be a simple single neuron connection. We call that a reflex. Whereas others can be quite complicated, like we see in our brain, where we can have thousands and thousands of synapses that help us make a very informed, intelligent, rational decision. That's something that is more complicated. That's something we're not going to get into in incredible detail here. Locomotion. Movement of the limbs. Repeated, coordinated contractions of various different muscles. And then it said reflexes as well. So that stereotypical response. Every single time I rest my knee and get right here in the patellar ligament, every time it's the same thing. Okay? You don't do this one time and my arm moves. No, it's always the leg there. Okay? It's repeated, or it's involuntary, stereotype responses. And we'll come back to more details later on. Surface anatomy. There's a lot of terms that you're going to see in here. And I'll tell you if there's something here that I don't expect you to know, but the majority of the terms that are here in bold are things you need to be familiar with. Okay? I didn't bring my laser pointer today. Actually, it doesn't belong to me, so I probably shouldn't bring it in. Okay. It's Lily's. It's $130 for a laser pointer. I know. I probably shouldn't use it in class. I know. Couldn't believe it either. Okay, so the spinal cord is here. It exists within the vertebral foramen. That's the hole that goes in the vertebrae. And you can see that it starts up, technically it starts here in the foramen magnum. So that's the technical start of the spinal cord. And then it goes down that column of bone tissue until right around L1. And that's where it terminates. Now, we're going to talk later on about membranes, and you can kind of see them here. Can you kind of, maybe I should turn off the light. Can you see the brown kind of goes all the way down in here as well? See that brown line? That's a membrane we're going to talk about later on. That membrane holds in fluid, we call cerebral spinal fluid. So the actual membrane extends all the way down beyond L5, but the cord stops here at L1. So we have space here that's only filled with fluid and not filled with cord. And this is important when you're going and taking out cerebral spinal fluid or if you're injecting into the cerebral spinal fluid, because you don't run the risk of hitting the cord. We'll come back to that in just a little bit. So it runs roughly 2/3 the length of the cord, or sorry, the vertebral canal, and we have 31, and that's the number I underlined in bold, 31 pairs of spinal nerves. And we'll talk more about these later on, but let me give you an example. So this line coming off here in yellow, and this one right here, each of those is a spinal nerve. So this is a pair right here of spinal nerves. Okay.
Why odd numbers?
Now, the cord is not visibly segmented. You can't look at the cord and say, oh, there's a segment, there's another segment. But people, for simplicity, say it's segmented. So they'll say this is a segment right here that it has these spinal nerves, and this is another segment, and another one, etc. So when they describe this and they talk about that, they'll talk about segmented parts of the cord. And that's all they really mean. Okay? Just so you're familiar with that word. Now you're going to see here, we have a groove. Now we actually have a groove on the posterior surface and on the anterior surface of the cord. So let me show you a better picture that really shows you that. Here. Here's a cross section of the cord. So we have a cross section, and you can see that the cord is somewhat divided. We have a little bit of a fissure or a division right here, and we have one in here as well. Okay, can you see that right there? So we have the anterior median fissure and the posterior median sulcus. Anterior median fissure, posterior median sulcus. So I could use this picture to ask you to describe those, even though it's not technically labeled here. You should be able to use different pictures. And I can show you some other ones here. Here's another picture, although I have to admit that the lettering here is a little bit off. But you can see that here is the posterior median sulcus, and here is the anterior median fissure. And again, it's kind of a separation. But notice that the two parts of the cord, if you want to call them left and right here, there's actually a physical connection. So they're not divided all the way through. There's a bridge, you might say, okay, that exists right here called the gray commissure. And within the gray commissure, there is what they call the central canal. So there's actually a hole within that. Going back here, just like we divide our bones, we can divide the cord. We have central, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral regions. You can see those here in this picture. So cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. And those spinal nerves that come out of those areas generally serve the body parts closest to them. You're going to see later on exactly how that happens. But you can imagine that the ones here in the cervical region are going to be serving the neck region. So the sensory input from the neck and the motor output to the neck will pretty much come out of these spinal nerves. As well as for the limbs, you'll see them come out of the same general region, right around the cervical. The thoracic are going to serve this general area, and again, the sensations for this general part of the body, including the internal organs, and then the motor control, again, will generally come from these spinal nerves, and so on and so forth, all the way down to the sacral, to the legs, and so forth. Okay? So that just gives you a general outlay of how that works. Two terms that I have here in bold that I will not actually ask you are on page 2. It says conus medullaris and cauda equina. Both in the top there, you can see conus medullaris and cauda equina. I don't believe I asked you that. If I do on the exam, I'll take it off. I don't think it's something that I want to focus on. But let me show you what that is, just so you're aware. So right here, the cord ends. And so we call that the conus medullaris. It's just the end of the cord. But if you notice, there are still parts of the spinal cord, what are we going to call that? Nerves that still go down. And that's what they're trying to show here. So there's little fibers that continue to go down. You can see all those fibers down here. So the fibers continue to go down. That branching of all those fibers coming down is called cauda equina. Again, not terms I'll ask you on the exam at all. Meninges. This is the protection for the spinal cord. This is a very important and critical piece of information we're going to be talking about. The meninges are important for the brain and the spinal cord. So this comes to a point in the class, I need to tell you that today is not going to be a complete lecture for you. Because the truth is, the brain and the spinal cord really should be taught in a lecture. We can't do that. It would take too long. So you're gonna learn some things today that are going to play a role for the brain and vice versa for the brain for the spinal cord. So just keep that in mind. You'll have to merge these kind of together in one big lecture as we go forward to really understand all the mechanisms. But the protection of the brain and spinal cord, one of those is the meninges, or the membranes that surround these organs. Now, if you think about the protection, well, we have physical protection in the bones, right? We have the cranium for the brain, and we have the vertebrae that protects the spinal cord. So that's a physical protection. But we also have the liquid through the spinal fluid that provides that cushion, right? And also supports the weight of the brain and the spinal cord as well. But the meninges play a very important role in holding in that spinal fluid, cerebral spinal fluid, as well as protecting the brain and spinal cord from infection. Getting an organism like a bacterium, a virus, a protozoa, a fungus, or what have you, in the spinal cord or the brain is usually terminal. These areas are, to a great degree, they have to remain sterile at all times. Most of the body internally is sterile. No organisms grow there. But particularly the brain and spinal cord need to remain sterile. We call an infection of these areas meningitis. You've probably heard that before. Okay? That's an infection of the meninges. And really what it's saying is you've got a brain infection or a spinal cord infection. And it's a really bad thing. It can kill you within 24 hours of getting it. That's how fast it can kill you. So meninges serve a very, very important role in protecting the brain and spinal cord because the majority of us will never have to endure that. You have a very good protection. And one way to think about this is, you know those nice yellow kitchen gloves that really keep keep your hands very, very dry, and they're really rubbery, thick. That's a good way of thinking about what this membrane is like, at least the outer membrane we call the dura mater, or the tough mother. It's very, very thick, like a rubber kitchen glove, kind of roughly like that thick. Okay? You're going to see how thick this really is next week when I give you brains that are covered in it, and you have to cut it off with scissors that are not that good. No, they did not dull the scissors on purpose, but it works out pretty well that way. So we have the meninges, okay? And again, they're protecting the brain. They're holding in the cerebral spinal fluid. And I'll show you a good picture. There's actually several good pictures, but this is one we can start off with. So when we get to the lab, just so you're aware, I could use this picture here on the right. I could use this picture here, or we can use this picture here. And I'll show you it on all these pictures, just so it's clear. But this one here is nice because I think it's a good one to start off with. It's nice and color-coded. Obviously the body's not color-coded, but at least for pictures we can do that with artists. So here, the dura mater, or the outer one, is brown, kind of rusty. So the most superficial is dura mater, okay? And that's what we see right here. So it's going to surround and fill up that area within the vertebrae, closest to the bone. As I said, it's very, very thick like a rubber glove, and it's a main protection here, main protective layer. Everything within that, all the space within that glove-like material of the dura mater is what we call epidural space. All of it. So when you get an epidural, what does that mean? Well, it means you're getting an injection through that membrane into that space. So a lot of times they'll give you some sort of pain medication. Really what they're going to do is they're going to block the nerves so you don't feel pain from some area down, right? That's how it works. So you give birth or whatever. So that's the idea behind that. We'll go back into that in a little bit more. So that's the epidural space. Just deep to that, we have the arachnoid matter. Arachnoid, like spider, is web-like. And the book actually did a nice job of making it kind of white. You can see that. All the fibers that make up that kind of membrane. So there's kind of a web-like appearance. This is not something you're going to see very easily next week. It's very difficult to see it in a preserved brain specimen. Okay? You'll see the dura mater for sure. Okay? Arachnoid mater, maybe. The pia mater is the deepest. Yes, you should know which one's more deep and which one's more superficial. It's the deepest here. Now, the book does a good job of making it pink for you to see that right here. Okay? Obviously, it's not pink. But when you get to the brain next week and you think, wow, I don't see the pia mater anywhere. The truth is, the brain you're looking at is the pia mater. That's what you're seeing. You can't remove it. It's physically not possible, it's not easily possible to remove it from the brain or spinal cord. It's kind of very strongly attached to it. So usually when you see the brain, it's got the pia mater already attached. Okay? This is showing you the same three, again, just from a different point of view. Again, the cord is wrapped up in these three membranes. The dura mater here, superficial, then going deep. You see the arachnoid mater, and then the pink right here is the pia mater. Now, I don't know why the book does this, but you can see the pink here, and you can still see it here. I don't think that makes sense, but whatever. So, it's this membrane right here is the pia, that's the arachnoid, and that's the dura. Okay? Now you can kind of see the same things here. So here is the dura, right here, kind of important to Rusty. The white here is obviously the arachnoid. And you're like, well, where's the pia? Well, it's surrounding the cord. It's right here on top of the cord. I wouldn't use that picture, but just so you're aware of that. That's what it is. Okay. Another term I wouldn't ask you is terminal filum. Okay, just so it's at the top of page 3. It's not, I don't know why it's bold. I just never went back and fixed it. Okay, cerebrospinal fluid. We've talked a little bit about this before, but not that much. 97% of the brain, the weight of the brain, is supported by fluid. The brain floats. And it floats in the cerebrospinal fluid. Now, the cerebrospinal fluid is actually produced by blood. And we'll actually see how it's produced next week, at least to some degree. It's very similar to blood plasma, although it's different in many contexts, including the different ion concentrations and things like that. But it at least originates from blood plasma. It nourishes the brain, it carries all the hormone signals to the brain in different parts of the brain. It obviously carries glucose and things like that, and oxygen that the brain needs. We're going to see later on next week that the cerebrospinal fluid actually moves. So we actually have movement through the brain and down the cord. And it's constantly moving from the ependymal cells.
Why can't we feel it?
You don't have, I don't know, you're not consciously aware of the feeling?
It's just like something that's just consciously moves all the time.
Let me ask you this. Do you wear a wedding ring or earrings or a watch on a regular basis? Do you feel it all the time?
No.
Why?
Because you just know it's there.
Your brain turns it off. It's unimportant. That's probably the answer. That's actually part of the brain's mechanism of how it works. These unimportant signals, it turns off. It only pays attention to it if your watch falls off suddenly. So if it suddenly stops, maybe you'll notice it. I never been asked that question. It's good. Okay. As I said, cross-section anatomy, this is a good picture here. This is actually a nice picture. It shows a lot of different things here. I wish these were more in line. I think it's kind of offset. This is anterior median fissure, posterior median sulcus we talked about. The gray and white matter. Gray and white matter. We introduced this last time. Again, the gray matter is the soma, right? It's the cells. So this is where the synapses are going to be occurring. Right there where the cells are, the actual cell bodies, is where the connections, the synapses are going to be. Okay? The white matter, well, the white matter are all the myelinated axons. So if you look at the cord, it's glistening white. That white matter of the cord are the axons, covered in myelin. That's why they're white. And so if you look at the design of the cord here, you can see that, okay, well, we have this H-like or butterfly-looking dark matter, or what we call gray matter, on the inside here. And that's where all the neural connections are occurring. And then out here, we have these columns of white. And so we can imagine, okay, we've got wires going this way, wires going that way, maybe wires going this way in all kinds of directions. It's the information highway. Those are the lanes in white. That make sense so far? So I mentioned these things before. The Great Commissure and the Central Canal are here. What I didn't mention to you are what we call horns. So the terms ventral and dorsal, you can interchange those terms with anterior and posterior if you want. Okay? I learned these using the terms ventral and dorsal. But your book uses them interchangeably, and I think that's fine. So my point is this. If you look here, can you see this point right here, this gray point back here, and another gray point here and one here? We call those horns. So this gray part that comes out this way that points in the backward direction is called the dorsal horn, or if you want to call it the posterior horn, I'm fine with that. Okay. This is called the ventral horn, or if you want to call it the anterior horn, I'm fine with that. And this is called the lateral horn. So here we have the dorsal, ventral, and lateral horns, or posterior, anterior, and lateral. Are we okay? Okay. Now this goes all the way down the cord. You're just seeing a cross section here. So this goes all the way down like this. Very similar fashion. And for the most part, it's the same. There are some enlargements. We're not going to get into discussing enlargements of the cord. There's two places they get bigger. The places that control your limbs. You need more information, more synapses. And so you'll see the cord will get a little bit thicker in those areas. Not something we're going to get into or you need to know. Okay, those just keep you curious. For the most part, that's what it looks like all the way down the cord. Okay. We'll get into more detail about this later on. In fact, I'll probably mention it at least 4 or 5 times today, meaning it's important to know eventually. We're going to see later on that we have these two parts right here. We have what's called the dorsal and the ventral roots that are going to make up the one spinal nerve. Now we call these little branches rootlets, and I don't really care that you know that term. But the posterior root, or dorsal root, and the anterior root, or as I said, ventral root, as I always called it, are different. They have different functions. And again, we're jumping ahead here, you'll see more detail. But what you're going to learn later on is the ones back here, these guys are involved in sensation. They're sensory neurons, or axons is really what they are. They're found right here. Okay? So all the sensory information that comes from out here, and here's the spinal nerve, so all this information coming this way is all going to travel up this way. This is the travel information that's ascending toward the control center, toward the brain. Sensation. When you think sensation, think back. Okay? Posterior, dorsal. When you think motor control, think ventral or anterior. So the brain will send out information, or not necessarily the brain in the spinal cord, will send information down these that'll go toward effectors, muscles. So this is the motor control. So when you end up having one spinal nerve, it's a mixture of sensory and motor. You have some fibers coming that are part of this, and some fibers coming as part of that, and we have what's called a mixed nerve. Some sensory, some motor. Good so far? Now to really throw you. Right here. Notice this is a nice little bulge. You only find this on the dorsal root. This is called the dorsal root ganglion, or posterior root ganglion. What is a ganglion? Well, it's a cluster of cell bodies, soma, that are outside the central nervous system. And that's exactly what this is. Here's the central nervous system. This is the cord. These guys are not in the central nervous system. They're outside in the peripheral nervous system. So the spinal nerves actually belong to the peripheral nervous system. So does this bulge right here. This is called, again, the posterior root ganglion or dorsal root ganglion, and it houses the neurons, the actual cells, the cell bodies of what? Well, sensory neurons, right? So I know this is kind of hard for you to understand because we talked about it in a different way. But let me just give you a brief idea of what this means. So you can imagine here is a single neuron. And I say single, one neuron. And we have one axon. Wait a minute, how does that make sense? It's nice, an easy way to think about it. Or if you want to think about it in a different way, you can almost think about this being a dendrite, because this is really what picks up the information over here, and this is what actually transmits it. So here in the hands, we're feeling cold, or we're feeling touch, or pressure, or pain. That information is going toward the cell body, which is right here. So yes, you are feeling the pain here, and one giant extension of one cell goes all the way to your cord. Just outside of it, in this ganglion right here. And then it sends information down this way to the actual cord where it actually will synapse with another neuron. So you have one neuron, literally one process that goes all the way from the end of your finger all the way to your, almost to your cord. That's how long those cells are. Pretty darn long. Okay. So that's what those are. The posterior root ganglion are the sensory axons, or sorry, the sensory somas of those cells. What about the white matter? Well, we talked about it a little bit before. Am I driving you crazy going back and forth?
Okay. No, you're fine.
Okay. The white matter is obviously the myelinated axons. And again, they're here, here, and here. So we call these columns, or finuliculi. Oh, just call them columns. Okay, it's fine to call them columns. So we have the posterior column, the lateral column, and the anterior column. Or again, what I always call it, dorsal, ventral, lateral. So right here, here's a column. So you can imagine all this white matter right here, going all the way down and up the cord, form a column. Think about what a column is, right? That's a column of white matter. And we call that the posterior or dorsal column, the anterior or ventral column, and this side over here we call the lateral column. Okay? And again, these are fibers, so you can imagine some of these fibers are going to be going up, ascending toward the control center, toward the brain, and some are going to be going down toward effectors, muscles. Okay? That's the way this is going to work. You're going to see more about that in a little bit. But does that make sense so far? Let me show you how that generally works. Now, this is not a picture that will ever pop up in your lab exam. It's just to show you a generalized picture. And in fact, the next couple pictures will never pop up in your exams. This is just to give you a general understanding of what we call tracts. Okay? What are tracts? Well, they're bundles of axons inside the central nervous system. Remember, bundles of axons outside the central nervous system, in the peripheral nervous system, we call nerves. Okay? So a nerve-like structure in the central nervous system is called a tract. So that's what we have here. So these are bundles. Okay? You can see here we have 5 or 6 or so different sets of bundles that have a particular purpose. So these bundles right here, or tracts, are ascending. They're going to go toward the control center. They're going to control certain parts of our body, or they're going to feel, I should say, certain parts of our body. They have different functions. The ones over here are going to be more motor control. So you're going to see more motor control in these 5 here. These are descending. So ascending and descending are 2 terms to be familiar with. We'll get into more details about these. These terms here that you're seeing, we're going to go through these.